Last week, an opinion piece titled How Taiwan Lost Trump by former U.S. State Department official Christian Whitten has stirred controversy. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Taiwan pushed back, saying the article's claim do not reflect the reality of Taiwan-U.S. relations. Officials stressed that Taipei maintains open communication channels with Washington and engages in close, constructive exchanges. In this article, Whitten argued that Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, government mishandled relationships with the Trump administration, leading to higher U.S. tariffs and a cooling of ties. Now, for this article, he actually singled out President Lai Ching-te, Vice President Hsiao Bi-khim, and Taiwan's diplomatic strategy for leaning too heavily towards progressive causes, failing to prioritize defense and trade concessions, neglecting outreach to Trump's political base. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Xiao Guangwei countered that regardless of which party is in power, the United States has consistently shown firm bipartisan support for Taiwan. He said the two sides have long been important security and economic partners, especially in global supply chains and maintaining regional peace and stability. The ministry reaffirmed its commitment to working closely with the Trump administration across multiple sectors to deepen the mutually beneficial partnership. But how did we get here? Well, let's rewind to April 2025 and trace the key moves that have brought Taiwan and much of Asia to this moment of tariff turbulence. Hi, you're listening to Beyond the Reefs, a show produced by Radio Taiwan International. Here we talk about socio-economic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world, beyond the reefs of this island nation. It all began in early April when the White House rolled out its, quote, reciprocal tariff, unquote, regime, a framework that, in plain terms, matches other countries' duties on U.S. goods and tightened small parcel import rules targeting China. This was the most sweeping tariff update since the 2018-2019 U.S.-China trade war, which reshaped global supply chains, I'm sure you remember that, and sent Asian manufacturers scrambling to diversify. Back then, Taiwan's exporters saw short-term gains from trade diversions. This time, the rules are broader and touch more sectors, making the playing field less predictable. By July, the U.S. had struck a deal with Vietnam, 20% tariffs on direct exports, 40% on transshipped goods. The latter aimed squarely at preventing Chinese products from being rerouted through third countries. In Japan's case, negotiators secured a framework lowering proposed duties to 15%, but a critical oversight meant that, quote-unquote, stacking could push the actual cost far higher. For importers, stacking isn't just a bureaucratic term. It means the difference between a viable shipment and a canceled order. Imagine a Japanese auto part that faces a 15% reciprocal tariff, but still gets hit with a 2.5% MFN duty and a 5% anti-dumping duty. Suddenly, the importer is paying closer to 23%, eating into margins or forcing a price hike downstream. In August, Trump turned heads with a threat to slap a 100% tariff on imported semiconductors, but only for companies without U.S. plants. That instantly buoyed TSMC's market outlook, echoing the way chip stock rallied during the CHIPS and Science Act rolled out in 2022. But days later, Japan won a formal no-stacking guarantee, the kind Taiwan's lawmakers are now demanding. Meanwhile, Washington extended its tariff truce with China by 90 days, giving breathing room for talks. This kind of deals would have collapsed under 2019's political pressure. Mid-month, new export license for Nvidia and AMD's China-specific chips came with a catch. 15% of related revenue would go to the U.S. Treasury. Malaysia, on its part, carved out exemptions for pharmaceuticals and semiconductors, a move seen as protecting its growing medtech and back-end chip assembly industries. Now, with pharmaceuticals under review for a possible tariff of up to 15% and defense spending pledges woven directly into trade negotiations, the intersection of politics, economics, and security has never been more visible, and that's where we're starting our conversation today.
With the latest round of U.S. tariffs taking effect, Taiwanese exports to the U.S., particularly those from traditional industries, could face serious costs due to tariff stacking. While final tariffs on Taiwan's semiconductor products are still pending, exporters in other industries like textiles, who originally faced tariffs of around 10 to 20%, are now seeing rates rise to between 30 to 40%. The same applies to other sectors like bicycles, plastics, rubber, and machinery. And agricultural and fishery products are now subject to 20% tariffs compared to none previously. In addition, importers of agricultural, fishery, and textile products are also likely to be among the most affected by the market opening to the U.S. Members from Taiwan's Federation of Industries and other experts are urging the government to take action and provide funding support.
In recent weeks, Washington's tariff conversation with Asian partners has widened well beyond steel, semiconductors, or the usual flashpoints. One of the latest sectors in the spotlight is pharmaceuticals. Taiwan's health minister, Chiu Tai-yuan, has said that Taiwan is already preparing for a worst-case scenario where the U.S. applies phased tariff hikes. In some proposals, up to 250% on certain drugs. That echoes the 2018 U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs, where high initial rates were later reduced for allies, but only after months of uncertainty that definitely disrupted orders. This time, Taiwan wants to avoid being caught flat-footed. The ministry has laid out 4 strategies: an early warning system to spot supply disruption, building up strategic drug stockpiles, keeping prices fair through the National Health Insurance Administration, and boosting domestic production of generics. That last point carries economic weight. About 70% of the more than 14,000 drugs in Taiwan's NHI system are quote-unquote generics or locally made. The other 30% are imports, and 214 of them are still under patent with no alternative suppliers. Lawmakers have approved approximately $666 million budget to keep these medicines covered. It's a safeguard, but industry insiders warn that even a modest 15% tariff on imported active pharmaceutical ingredients could quickly ripple through to consumers, just as past raw material price hikes did during COVID-19. The U.S. frames pharmaceutical tariffs under the same national security, quote-unquote, rationale as steel and semiconductors, citing over-dependence on India and China for key ingredients. Critics, including U.S. hospital associations, counter that such tariffs could raise healthcare costs and worsen shortages, especially in rural and lower-income communities.
The government has a plan in place to help domestic businesses weather U.S. tariffs, but there are still lots of Taiwan-owned businesses abroad that need help too. Now, there's a plan in the works to help them stay afloat. The Overseas Community Affairs Council, or OCAC, has met with Taiwanese business people based around the world. And it's found most have one thing in common: a need for financing, as tariffs force them to shift the layout of their investments. So the council's teamed up with Taiwan's Overseas Credit Guarantee Fund to make getting that cash easier. There are further perks too, including some help with covering interest and processing fees. Many of the businesses facing the squeeze are small to medium-sized, and those that get approved for both kinds of relief can have a few $1 million to cushion the impact of tariffs. Best of all, from the perspective of banks, is that the council guarantees 90% of the loans, lowering risk. But there are limits to this relief program. The $300,000 loan, for instance, will only be offered for 1 year. And there are also rules about which overseas companies can get tariff relief. The Taiwanese business people based in Southeast Asia and Latin America, sitting on either side of these officials, express hope about the plan as a means to deal with deep uncertainty in the U.S., one of their big export markets. The relief program is set to start in September. And while U.S. tariffs will bite, especially in some countries, the hope is to give Taiwanese businesses abroad a chance to adapt and make it through.
For Taiwanese businesses overseas caught in the tariff crossfire, Taipei is trying to cushion the blow. The Overseas Community Affairs Council, OCAC, will launch a loan guarantee program in mid-September for companies directly or indirectly affected by U.S. reciprocal tariffs. The program will cover up to 90% of a loan, capped at $300,000 with terms of up to 3 years and the option for one extension of another 3 years. Applicants have to show a revenue drop of at least 10% since the tariff took place, though the fund says that it will interpret these borderline cases generously. So it's a nod to lessons learned during COVID-19 era relief programs. The OCAC will also subsidize guarantee fees for up to 3 years and part of the interest for 6 months. The bigger flashpoint came when Taiwan learned its provisional 20% reciprocal tariff rate would also, like Japan, be applied using stacking, layered on top of other duties, other tariffs that makes the effective rate higher than the headline figure, potentially erasing competitiveness in U.S. markets.
Lawmakers here in Taiwan from both major parties are reacting to reports that U.S. President Donald Trump could be using tariff negotiations to pressure Taiwan into boosting its defense spending. The comments come after the Washington Post reported that a Trump administration negotiation document shows Washington planned to use tariffs to achieve a range of national security goals, including urging Taiwan, India, and Indonesia to spend more on defense or buy more U.S. weapons. The U.S. State Department has not commented on the report. Some lawmakers here say buying weapons won't necessarily improve Taiwan's trade balance. Taiwan's military is expected to propose a special defense budget worth nearly $23.5 billion US dollars, while next year's defense spending will increase to 3% of GDP.
According to the Washington Post, U.S. negotiators are linking trade concessions to defense commitments, pressing countries like Taiwan, India, and Indonesia to raise defense spending or expand U.S. arm purchases. This is a tactic not unlike the Trump administration's approach to NATO burden sharing, using economic levers to drive security outcomes. Economically, it turns tariff leverage into export contracts. Strategically, it deepens U.S. security ties in Asia. This linkage is sensitive because earlier this month, Taiwan's economic minister had to clarify comments about the cost of cutting its tariff rate from 20% to 15%. He suggested a $400 billion US dollars investment might be needed, double earlier public estimates, prompting a quick correction from the ministry and the executive yuan. Officials say talks are still active within bilateral working groups and no figure has been finalized. The political subtext is that tariff negotiations are no longer siloed. They're part of a broader package deal where defense, technology, and government spending and trade are all intersecting.
U.S. President Donald Trump on Wednesday announced that his administration will impose a tariff of about 100% on semiconductor chips imported into the country. But he said that will not apply to companies that are building factories in the United States or have made a commitment to do so in the country.
The good news for companies like Apple is if you're building in the United States or have committed to build, without question committed to build in the United States, there will be no charge. In other words, we're not going to be charging. So a lot of countries, a lot of companies are leaving various other places and they're coming to the United States. So in other words, we'll be putting a tariff on of approximately 100% on chips and semiconductors. But if you're building in the United States of America, there's no charge, even though you're building and you're not producing yet in terms of the big numbers of jobs and all of the things that you're building. If you're building, there will be no charge. So I just want everyone to know that. And I didn't even tell you that inside. We discussed the concept, but I didn't. So it's a big factor.
The announcement is expected to hit semiconductor chip makers and exporters to the U.S., though many major players said they will not be impacted as they already have had operations or pledged investments in the country. South Korea's trade negotiators said Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix will not be subject to such tariffs. Asian equities rose in the morning as markets largely shook off the latest tariff threats from the U.S. administration, including the tariffs on chips and an additional 25% tariff on India over purchases of Russian oil.
On August 7th, Trump announced plans for a 100% tariff on all semiconductors entering the U.S., with exemptions for companies building or operating fabs in America. That put TSMC in the clear. It had pledged $200 billion investment in the US, and markets responded instantly. TSMC's shares hit record highs, and Taiwan's benchmark stock index jumped over 600 points in one day. It is the biggest company in Taiwan, after all. National Development Council Minister Paul Liu, who also sits on TSMC's board, noted that excluding TSMC, Taiwan's chip exporters to the U.S. total less than $6 billion annually. That's about 1.1% of total exports. While that limits direct exposure, opposition lawmakers warn that such tariff pressures could accelerate the hollowing out, quote unquote, of Taiwan's chip sector if more production shifts to the U.S. Meanwhile, Washington added a new lever recently, a revenue-sharing rule for certain advanced chips sold to China. Under an August 14 deal, Nvidia and AMD can export China-specific GPUs, which was restricted or completely banned before, but they must hand over 15% of related revenue to the U.S. Treasury. While it currently applies to only those two American firms, the White House hasn't ruled out expanding it, raising speculation about whether foreign players like TSMC could eventually be pulled in to pay directly to the U.S. Treasury, especially if geopolitical tensions spike again.
Nvidia and AMD may be trading 15% of their Chinese sales revenue in exchange for the right to sell their chips there. Now, this is because currently advanced AI chips are restricted by U.S. export controls. There's been an on and off again struggle between U.S. chip makers like Nvidia and the White House over this issue for the past several months. Now, several are questioning whether this move aligns with the U.S. stated goal of slowing down Chinese AI development and keeping America's edge. One analyst that I spoke to sent me a written response that says, in part, while this 15% fee might support U.S. initiatives like subsidies for domestic chip production, it could also harm long-term U.S. tech competitiveness by accelerating China's drive for self-reliance, shifting the global AI landscape in the years ahead. For Taiwan, of course, more chip sales in China means more orders for companies like TSMC, which is good for their bottom line. But the Taiwanese government has also expressed similar concerns to the U.S. about censorship and security in Chinese AI models, so it's a bit of a mixed bag.
However, there is a silver lining. Maybe, just maybe, if government talks stall, it could be someone like Jensen Huang, who happens to be Taiwanese American, who tips the balance. The Nvidia CEO has become one of the hottest and most sought-after figures in Washington and Beijing. He's managed to secure approval to sell the H20 chips to China while winning U.S. tariff exemptions for semiconductor firms committed to building American plants. Back in April, Huang met Trump at Mar-a-Lago, arguing that selling certain chips to China wouldn't harm U.S. security, and pairing that pitch with a $500 billion pledge for AI and supercomputing facilities in the U.S. Last month, the Trump administration reversed course, greenlighting H20 sales, and a week later, the White House, Trump floated a 20% China revenue share, where Huang then countered with 15%, and that's where we got our earlier stories of 15%, and came armed with data showing tariffs could undercut U.S. chip production goals. Days later, Trump agreed with the U.S. fabs, confirm exemptions for these firms. China quickly responded, lifting restrictions on certain U.S. software firms, shelving a regulatory case against Nvidia, and signaling that it wants Jensen Huang to keep pushing in Washington. It's a reminder that sometimes the bridge between the two capitals isn't a policy memo or a trade mission. It could be a business leader with enough influence, credibility, and capitals to make both sides listen. For Taiwan, that could mean working more closely with such figures to keep its seat at the table in this very high-stake tariff game. And hopefully we've explained that game rather well today. That is a brief and very condensed recap of the trade developments and the tariff turbulence over the last 4 months. If we missed any information or if you learned something from this episode, please do let me know. You can write to me, Joey Chow, that's JoeyChou @rti.org.tw. Until next time, this is Beyond the Reefs.